So the question before us this morning is, why believe in God? We've been hearing about that already in the service. Joe has shared with us really helpfully. I'm going to answer that question thinking particularly from a Christian perspective, why believe in a Christian God. Let me talk to you about Barbara. I worked for Barbara a couple of decades ago. She was a great woman, a bright, intelligent, vivacious woman, a wonderful boss. I enjoyed working for Barbara. And Barbara came from a completely unchurched background. So she didn't grow up in a Christian home. She never went to church through her teenage years into her adult life. I went off to Cambridge, studied there engineering, and got married, and then became pregnant. And the day that Barbara, how she describes it, she gave birth, her life turned upside down in many, many ways. Firstly, she held her baby daughter in her hands, and she used to say to me, Simon, like my new caverns of love just opened up in my heart. She looked at this daughter, her and husband looked at this daughter, and she said almost immediately, I just started asking questions about life, the purpose of life. The reason. She looked into her daughter's eyes and thought, there's got to be more to life than this. How does life come into being? Are we really saying this is just a kind of result of evolutionary chance? As she looked at her daughter, like fearfully and wonderfully made. So what's the reason for this? And so she started thinking about these questions. She started reading. Bob was a great reader. She started investigating different opinions and faiths. And one time, months later, she found herself going to church. And she sat in church and she opened a Bible just like we'd done. And she kept reading that Bible. And she actually went back to church. And as she heard about the message of the God of the Bible, and specifically the person of Jesus Christ, who he was, his life, his historical life, his death, and the empty tomb, the resurrection, Easter, Barbara came to believe. She believed in God. Decades later, she's still believing, still worshiping Jesus Christ, as do a third of the population of this earth. You might not be someone who follows Jesus right now, but you've got to be amazed that an ordinary carpenter, a little backwater place called Galilee, has turned the world upside down through what he said, through what he did. Now, I want you to notice with me a couple of elements of the process of what Barbara and loads of people I speak to, something similar they would describe. Aren't there, these key moments in life where we just have like a profound moment of thinking about. It might be the cause of life, like birth or death. It might be a great sorrow. It might be a great joy. And we think to ourselves, what is life about? Why am I here? Where am I going? We ask those kind of questions. We might look at life and think, I would be amazed at the wonder. Do you see Barbara did that, didn't she? She looked at the wonder of her newborn baby daughter and she thought, wow, look at how amazingly we made. She looked at her eyes. Like how amazing and complex is the eye? You think, the iris and the lens and cones and rods. What an amazing bit of kit. What an amazing bit of invention. The eye. And she started investigating, didn't she? She was a bright lady. She kind of thought through, like all of you. She was thoughtful. She said, look, there are different ways of answering that question. They can't all be right. Seriously, we can't say that some things are right and yet contradictory kind of opinions of thought, they're right as well. She said, there's got to be right and wrong. I kind of live my life. That's how Barbara was described. She lived my life on recognizing truth and error, right and wrong. And so she investigated, didn't she? She looked into this question, and she didn't just kind of like think, it might be a bit of indigestion I'm feeling right now, or that was a pretty traumatic thing, birth. I'm just going to, she looked into it. She investigated these serious questions of life. Now, those questions are common. Joe mentioned many of them in the interview, and if you'll have noticed, many of them appeared in this Psalm 19. So just track them with me. Firstly, did you see verse 1? Look down at verse 1. The heavens declare the glory of God. God is seen in this psalm as the first cause, the unmoved mover. Before anything else, the reason for everything else is God. You see in verse 4, look, in the heavens, God has pitched a tent. So this infinite, eternal, glorious being, we can't kind of infinitely, regressively go back further and further. What caused? There is a God, these words say, who made us, who made this world. And we see that here in this psalm as well, don't we? We see very clearly design. Do you see the design language? In verse 1, look, the skies proclaim the work of his hands. Did you see that in verse 4? The heavens, God has pitched a tent for the sun. God has made this sun using very poetical language, the sun rising and the sun falling. Do you see in verse 6? Nothing is deprived of its warmth. This world, amazing and beautiful and complex, is designed by this God. William Paley, a philosopher, he famously described what we've just seen there like this. He said, imagine you're walking along a beach one day and you see a watch, one of those kind of waist pocket watches, the beautiful sphere. You bend down, you pick it up, and it's this beautiful gold disc and beautiful dials and numbers, and you flip open the back and look inside, and there are these cogs and wheels whirring away. It's an amazing watch. Now, when you look at it, when you pick it up, you could say, look, this is just the product of chance. All this intricacy, these signs of design, of things being knit together, it's just chance. But you might want to ask about this after. We could talk about this after the Q&A time. I think that's a great leap of faith. I think you could have like an infinite amount of time and multi-universes and say, do we really think that a watch could just come together like that in all its amazing intricacy? Or when you see the watch, do you think, oh, that's made by someone? When a gold watch, one of the things we do, we'll flip it open and look for the maker's mark, won't we? We'll look for the stamps on the watch and think, oh yeah, that's the person who's made it. And that's what this psalm says. This psalm says, you, me, this world, we are stamped with the maker's mark, with something that is designed by God. So God is the first cause. God is the designer. Do you see how there's this in the psalm, this sense of right and wrong in the psalm? Look at verse 7. There's this language of God's law being perfect. Statutes trustworthy. The precepts of the Lord are right. Do you see that word right? Look at verse 9. All of them are righteous. There's this language of right and wrong in the psalm, that we can know what is just and unjust. There is a moral fabric to the world. C.S. Lewis, commonly the person who wrote The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, he said, if you look across history and cultures and time and space, there seems to be in our world just this foundational sense of right, of truth, of error. Across all religions, doesn't there? There seems to be this idea of forgiveness and the wrongness of lying and the wrongness of murder. The question is, where does that come from? Where do we get that sense of right and wrong, and that universal sense of right and wrong? And then fourthly, do you see the poet talking about the Bible? So as Barbara kind of read the Bible, and as she listened to what the Bible was saying, she saw there that the Bible describes itself as, look at verse 7, the law of the Lord. She saw there was something special about this book, Genesis to Revelation. The statutes of the Lord being trustworthy. Look at verse 8, the precepts of the Lord, the commands of the Lord. Look at verse 9, the decrees of the Lord. She came to see and believe that this word speaks God's word to us. That the great God of the universe, yes, he's creator, he's over the whole world, but he's personal, he's involved himself, he's spoken, and we have his words in this book. If you've ever put a piece of IKEA furniture together, now they're mostly pictures, aren't they? Well, there are a few words in there, but you kind of get open that. You got all the bits of wood and whatnot, and screws and little bits of doweling and whatever. If you put away the instructions, you can have a go at putting it together. If you're anything like me, you'll make a real hash of it. We need the instructions, the diagrams, those words, just to be able to know, look, how does it all fit together? How do I build this rightly? And that's what we see here in this psalm. The law of the Lord, God's word, the Bible. And in it all, there is this element of profound beauty and satisfaction and joy. Did you see that in verse 10? Look at verse 10. More precious than gold, sweeter than honey. The psalmist seems to be arguing, that satisfaction, we will be a dissatisfied people. We will be a people always looking and searching for more till we find God and his word. And that's where sweetness and the ultimate reason for beauty and the ultimate reason for the world is found, the wonder of the world in this God. So do you see many of the themes there that Barbara felt? Just the Bible, just the wonder of God as that first cause, his design, how he speaks about right and wrong, how he's made us to know that, how he's spoken in his word, this word which is good and satisfying. Now, the psalmist, this psalm, this poem, it takes a surprising turn, doesn't it, in verse 11. Did you see that, verse 11? By them your servant is warned, in keeping them his great reward. Look at verse 12. Who can discern their own errors? Forgive my hidden faults. Keep your servant from willful sins. Verse 13. Then I will be blameless, innocent of great transgression. You see, the Bible tells us that even though there are all these wonderful pointers, these wonderful signs as we travel along life, hey God, I'm here, I exist. By nature, we reject God. Sin means to miss the mark, to not live up to something, to not live up to what God commands. Transgress means to move outside of a boundary line, to kind of go our way, wander off. Think of that word, transgression, kind of moving outside of a boundary, moving outside of a line. You think about our lives, okay? We follow rules and boundary lines all the time. Think about how we do sport. If you watch Chelsea and Liverpool play yesterday evening, that was a great 0-0 draw, all the way to penalties. That game was played following the boundary lines of that sport. What's in the line? What's over the line? Did the ball cross the line? Liverpool managed to get that ball across the line once more than Chelsea after 2 hours of football. That's how we're wired as humans. We get that. And here the psalmist says, do you know what? All of us by nature have rejected God's lines. We've moved across God's boundaries. We've ignored his good laws. We've rejected him. And that's why these signs of design and right and wrong and God himself and his word, now by nature, we push them away. But the psalm ends with amazing hope. You say to me, oh, I hear what you're saying. You're saying, God, the Bible says God clearly has made the world. All of us don't want to know about that. That's desperate. That leaves us hopeless. But look at how the psalm ends. Look at that amazing verse 14. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be pleasing in your sight, Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Remember that last word of the psalm. It's a word of great hope. Redeemer. When you redeem something, you buy it back. You pay the cost to get something back that was lost. And that is what God has done for us in Jesus. Jesus is the central message of the Bible. We should know God and his world. We should love God. We walked away from him, and God has come looking for us in Jesus, the historical reality of Jesus Christ. And Jesus Christ said, look, I've come to redeem. I've come not to be served, but to serve and give my life as a ransom for many. I'll tell you what Jesus is like. Look at verse 5. And if you read the New Testament, you'd see these two themes beautifully described. Jesus is like a bridegroom coming out of his chamber looking for his bride, looking for people who've walked away from God. And he says, I love you, come back to me. Jesus is like the champion. Do you see that in verse 5? Rejoicing to run his course. Because Jesus came to this world, lived a perfect life, and went to die a sacrificial death for rebels like you and me. Jesus was the champion who took all the wrongs of the world and paid God's just judgment for it on the cross and defeated it. Defeated death. He rose again. The tomb is gloriously empty. Jesus says, I am God, the way to God. I will pay for your rebellion. Trust in me. The psalm ends with redemption. So, I finished. Let me finish with this. Imagine a man is on top of a roof and there's floods all around him. You might have heard this illustration before. And the rain is pouring and his life is ending. And he thinks to himself, well, this is a good chance now for God to prove himself to me. I'm in this flood, my life's going to end, and I'm going to see if God exists. And so he says, I'm going to wait for God to rescue me. So the rain is pouring, and along comes a dinghy with his neighbors in it. And the neighbors say, get in the dinghy. We'll take you to stay. He says, no, this is a chance for God to show that he exists and to rescue me. So the dinghy goes off, and then comes a rescue boat, the official rescue boat. They're getting all the community into the boat. They're rescuing people. They're all in need. And he says to the people in the rescue boat, no, God, this is a chance for God to prove himself. He's going to rescue me. So off the rescue boat goes. And then finally a helicopter comes, and winches a guy down and says, look, you're about to die. You're in big trouble. Get hold of this, And he says, no. This is God's chance now to prove conclusively, without doubt, that he exists. On your way. And the floods rise up, and he dies. And he gets to heaven, and he says there's God. So God did exist. And he says to God, what were you doing? And God says, what were you doing? God says to him, he said, well, I was waiting for you. He said, I sent you the neighbors. I sent you that rescue boat. I sent you that helicopter for you to be safe, for you to be rescued. And you know what? When we live in God's world and we say, hey, God, you're going to have to show and prove to me now conclusively that you exist. Do you know what God says? Listen, my friend, my created one, I have put all around you amazing displays of my existence. Just this sense of the divine inside that you're pushing down. The wonder of the world. Your son, look at your daughter. Just this sense of right and wrong, of justice, of injustice. Justice must be done. I've spoken personally in my word, but most of all, supremely of it all, I've sent Jesus. And you listen and look at Christ, you see me. And as you read of him and see what Jesus did and see the empty tomb, you get like it all pulled together there in that one man. I am God, and I called you to love and follow me.